So the best negotiators are the ones that are obsessed trying to figure out what matters to the other side. And not
Ooh, stop
necessarily.
there. That's really, really important.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change? I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TruthWorks. I'm Jessica Neal, and I'm here with Patty McCord, of course.
Yo.
And today we have a very, very special guest. Her name is Sandra Matz. And Sandra, I'm going to let you fill everybody in on you, but you are a professor at the Columbia School of Business, and you do lots of teaching, obviously, but also lots of research on behavior and organizations. And I'm not going to spoil it, but the stuff that you do is just really interesting. So tell us a little bit about you and what it is that you do and why you are doing it.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me. And I'm glad you found me. My background is interesting in a way that I'm actually kind of walking in the worlds of psychology, computer science, and business. So I was trained as a psychologist. I'm interested in human behavior. Like, why do people do the stuff that they do? What's driving their behavior, the way that they think? What maybe makes us different from one another? So coming more from a more personality psychology angle. And then I got interested in the computational space. So the idea of how do we actually study human behavior, right? So as psychologists, we typically used to give people questionnaires. We invite them to the lab. They press a bunch of buttons on the laptop, but we're really not studying human behavior as it unfolds in everyday life. And suddenly there was this computational lens where we could just look at the traces that people leave as they interact with technology, anything from social media, credit card spending, the data that's captured by your smartphone. And it turns out that we can learn a lot about people's daily habits, their preferences, their routines, just by looking at the data. So kind of combining psychology with data science and computer science. And then the last part is the business world, which is really like this question of, okay, we can understand human behavior, but what do we do with this understanding? So now I'm kind of looking at this in the context of organizations, trying to not just really understand and predict behavior, but also potentially change it, the way that people make decisions, the way that make people make choices. So that's, I think, the three worlds that I'm playing in.
Fascinating.
Wow.
Okay. Well, I have a ton of questions, but walk us through a recent study or finding, and then we can kind of get into teasing that out.
Yeah, very happy to. It's funny because I think, so for me, the interesting part was always like, how do we understand people at an individual level, right? I think you see this constantly in marketing, where companies have long understood that not all consumers are the same, right? It was always, well, how do you target the right customer with the right message at the right time? And on some level, that was really difficult to do. You could do this on demographic level, right? You could say, well, we're going to target men and women, or we're going to target someone in a specific location, but that only goes so far. What you really want is like replicating the offline world where you meet someone on the street, you have a customer that comes back every day, every week to buy groceries from your little corner store, and you know them personally, right? You understand what's up with their family, what are their dreams, what are their motivations, what are they hoping to become. And you customize everything that you do around it, both in terms of what you offer, how you talk to them. And so some of the work that I did pretty early on was trying to see, can I essentially replicate this online? Can I take someone's digital footprints? So that could be your Facebook likes, your Facebook status updates, your credit card spending. Can I turn this into something that humans can make sense of? That could be personality traits, for example. So can I predict whether you're more extroverted or more introverted based on your social media data? And then really trying to figure out, well, to what extent can I use these insights to potentially change your behavior? So what this looked like in some of the studies that we've done, for example, is that we took someone's Facebook likes, translated that to extroversion, introversion, and then we worked with a beauty retailer in the UK. This is like a specific case study. And we just said like, well, can we sell the same beauty products to women who are more extroverted and more introverted, right? They might not use beauty products for the same reason. Extroverts might want to go out there, have a great time with their friends, kind of be the center of attention. And that's what we try to reflect in the ads that we show those women. And I think the picture was always like people dancing. There was a lot going on. The copy would say something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. And for introverts, it was the opposite. It was like one person in front of the mirror, like a much more reserved and quiet setting. And the idea was that if we managed to target people with a matching ads and messages in this case, that they would be much more likely to click and purchase. And that's exactly what we found. So for me, this was like one of these initial studies that's saying, well, there is a way in which we can replicate some of this very personal offline experience that we have when we grow up in like a small village, for example, to like a much larger scale environment where we don't have this natural interaction. And from there, and so for me, this was really a starting point. For me, the interesting part is that it's not just selling products, right? So we can use the same thing to help people save more, for example. We could use it to help people essentially kind of do better with their mental health. We could think of it in organizations, right? Think of it the same thing that we use for customers. What if we could understand our employees the same way? What if we could understand, well, what's really driving their motivation at work? How do we compensate them, not just with money, but with stuff that actually resonates with them? So for me, just the interesting part is we can really tap into people's psychology and potentially help them live healthy and happier lives. It's a long-winded answer, but that's really what's driving a lot of the stuff that I do.
Lots of, to it, huh?
Yeah. So I really don't want you to analyze my social media accounts. I was just like thinking that. I was like, oh God, if they see the stuff that I like this is, but I'm sure it does tell a lot about me. Or my spending. I was like, oh God.
I was going to say, because I think most people, it's so funny because when I give talks, most people are like, either they're terrified because they have like so much stuff on social media, or they're super proud and they tap themselves on the shoulder for not using social media. And then I have to break it to them like, well, even if you're not using social media, right, there's just no way that you can escape this because you have a smartphone, which you carry with you 24/7, right? And that kind of knows exactly where you are, who you meet, what you do. And it's just as intimate as social media. So kind of escaping this being tracked and potentially being profiled is just almost impossible. Happy to go into the ethics at some point, but it's really hard to escape.
Yes, I'm sure it is. Maybe we can go back in time because you mentioned a small village. And I think,
I was reading about that too. Yeah.
Tell us the story.
Yeah, very happy to. So I grew up in it's literally like a tiny village. So a tiny village in the southwest corner of Germany, 500 people.
Wow.
It was so small that it didn't have a single shop. There's one church, 2 restaurants. And I think my experience of growing up there was really just everybody knew everything about everybody else, right? So you have me and 499 other people, and they just constantly observe what you're doing. So they observe the stuff like social media, the stuff that you explicitly put out there, right? So if I dye my hair a certain color, or I have like a bumper sticker on the car, they kind of understand the signals that I'm sending, but they also observe everything else. So the same way, it's not just social media, what I just said, but also like your smartphone sensing like everything that you do and where you go. They constantly saw me running to the bus, right? So they were like, well, clearly she's most of the time actually missing it. But they were like, well, she's probably not the most organized person. So they kind of were really in my business and tried to make these inferences from what is it that she's doing on a day-to-day basis to who she is like in terms of the more psychological depth. What are the motivations? What is she trying to accomplish in life? And that meant 2 things. So one is on some level, and now that I live in New York City, it's like a completely different world. What I miss about it is I don't think there's ever been a community that understood me that well, right? So they kind of saw me growing up. They knew exactly who I was dating, what I was doing on the weekend, like what I was struggling with. And they were there to offer amazing advice. So they knew exactly what I was hoping to do after school, and they could connect me with the right people. They encouraged me to go on a trip around the world. So that was the amazing part. The obviously not so amazing part is that they also interfered with life in ways that I didn't want, right? So it's not just that they were like, oh, here's what she's hoping to accomplish, let's help her. They were also trying to pull the strings behind my back without ideally me noticing. And I think for me, what's so interesting about this experience of growing up in the village and the work that I do today is that there's so many parallels. So we don't live in, like, I don't live in a small village, but there's still someone who's constantly observing my behavior. Again, now these digital traces that I create for the same purpose, right? So companies don't just collect the data about you because they want to peek into your psychology. They collect it because they want to change your behavior. The same way that my village neighbors were just in there to mess with my life. Sometimes that was great, and sometimes that was like not so great.
Right. No, I grew up in a small town too. And I totally get it. My mom, I did this painting in college of a nude person. And my mom, she had all my paintings from college. I'm older and an adult and I'm married and whatever. And I call her and she tells me this whole story about how she was trying to clean everything out and that she was going to put it in the garbage, but she knew the garbage man would see it and that he would think really bad things of my mom and dad. And I was like, that is the most ridiculous
But that's
thing.
actually like small village mentality. No? Like in New York, nobody's worried that someone is going to go through your garbage.
No,
But think about it. It's the same on the internet. Right. So on the internet, you delete something, it's never going to be deleted. I think that's one of the differences that I see between the village and like the world that we live in today is it used to be like what happens in the village stays in the village, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it spreads to the next village if you're unlucky and the gossip kind of gets passed
or there's
around.
relatives there. Yeah.
But you could leave the village. Like if you did
Right.
something, like the mailman saw the nude picture in the trash can, you just move to the next town, right? If that's the end of your village life. And that's just not possible anymore because it's everywhere.
No, I moved every 2 years of my life. I was just thinking as both of you were talking, it's like every time I did, I thought I could reinvent myself.
Yeah.
Because, they didn't know anything about me. Now I realize it would all come with me.
Yeah, you can't leave it behind, Patty. So take us back to the research and what you've learned about leadership, work, life, like how people behave, and talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, the first thing that I learned is actually that it's much harder to do research within organizations, I should say. So I started my journey in the consumer space, and the data is out there scattered. It's extremely easy to get. It's extremely easy to buy in whatever way. Like organizations, for good reasons, are a lot more careful in the way that they use data, right? So even when I tell organizations, wouldn't it be amazing if you could understand your employees the same way that you understand your customers and then potentially help them make the most in terms of productivity, in terms of like work-life balance, satisfaction? They're oftentimes much more careful in the extent to which they want to. Yeah, exactly. So I think there's there's almost this healthy skepticism that you see when organizations think about their employees that I don't see when they think about their customers, right? So this is really productized on the customer side. And I'm happy that this is the case, that they're much more careful when they think about this internally. But we did one study at some point where we essentially tried to mimic what we had done in the consumer space with employees. So in this case, we were working with, and this is unpublished work, so take it with a grain of salt. But essentially, we try to work with car salespeople, and they usually it's very much based on how much cars they sell, right? Like how much money do they make? And then there's a reward system where they can get stuff online, and it's like an entire platform. And it's a little bit like, Netflix. It's just an enormous amount of stuff that they can get on this rewards and recognition platform. There's just like no way that any sane person with also life outside of a rewards and recognition platform can go through all of the items that are on it. So there needs to be some way in which you help people find the stuff that's actually relevant to them. Because at the end of the day, the more they enjoy this experience, the more likely they are to sell cars the next month. So the idea that we had is, well, if we can use like insights into your psychology to sell you certain products or to get you to save, could we also just use it to filter, or like not even filter, just sort the products that are on this platform, right? So if I understand that you're extroverted, maybe the products that I'm going to surface at the top are the ones that allow you to have a good time with friends, are the ones that allow you to be social. And the ones for introverts would be a different one. So we
Are
essentially
there introverted salespeople?
There are not that many, but there are. And that's just one dimension. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Extroversion is like one of the big ones well, that's actually, it's an interesting question because we know that people can, right? I think oftentimes we think of personality as like it's set in stone. We do know that people can act out of character, right? So I am probably more introverted. The moment that I step into the classroom, I can totally turn on my extroverted side.
Right.
Now, am I exhausted after 3 hours of teaching? 100%.
Yeah.
But the same is true for it usually takes a toll in our cognitive resources and sometimes also on the health-wise. But the idea was that essentially, can we help people find the stuff that's relevant for them? And what we showed is that people were more satisfied with the platform, and they also, again, in this case, depending on their motivation, they also sold more cars later. So it depends a little bit on whether you're extrinsically and intrinsically motivated. But there was this kind of effect that if you help people based on their psychology find the stuff that's supposed to motivate them, that this actually then translates into more cars sold in the next month. So it's just like one example where I think you can see that the same way that we think about customers, technically also think about employees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We did so much research on that at Netflix from forever and ever and ever. And what was interesting was when we went to the streaming platform, we had all this data from DVD.
Yeah.
And now, when you look back on it, it's like, wow, we discovered it was an elephant, but we didn't know
how big it was.
Yeah, how big it was. Or, that metaphor is so perfect. It's like, I found a trunk.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Another thing I heard yesterday on the radio as I was driving was that there's some research now that says that it's possible that chat bots can change people's perspective on politics.
Oh,
yeah.
I believe it.
So now mapping that, what exactly was it? The reward system that changed their behavior, or knowing how they operated?
It's like a super interesting question. I mean, it's like one of the contexts that I'm really interested in, right? Because it has like a huge potential for abuse, but I actually think that there's also a huge potential to fix politics, right? If you know that like most people don't even bother to go out and vote, then there's also like a pretty big challenge that we have with just engaging people and also allowing them to see different perspectives. So I think what's interesting about and I don't know which research that was specifically, but there's a lot of work on what's called moral reframing. And I think of it as almost like a subcategory of this notion of psychological targeting, right? What I talked about before is like you tap into someone's extroversion and you sell them more products. So moral reframing is essentially trying to understand what are people's moral foundations? So how do they think about what's right or wrong in the world? And there's this framework which I really like. It's called the moral foundations. It has like loyalty, care, authority, purity, and fairness. And what we know is that if you look at the more liberal to more conservative spectrum on like politics, that people just put different emphasis on some of these foundations, right? So liberals typically tend to favor care and fairness, and then the more conservatives put like more emphasis on authority, loyalty, and purity. And the way that we usually craft political arguments is super self-focused. Right? It's like really egocentric. If I try to convince someone on the other side that immigration is actually a good thing, I use my own lens because that's the only lens on the world that I have, right? So Democrats typically talk about, well, we just have to care about other people and it's only fair if da-da-da-da-da. And they're trying to convince the more conservative people, but it's not really resonating with them because that's not how they think about the world in terms of what's right or wrong. What we know is if you can take that perspective, right? Like, let's say you make a pro-abortion argument in a way that resonates more with conservatives, the chances that you're actually going to convince them, or at least to become open to the idea, is much higher if you argue from their perspective and not yours. Now, humans have a really hard time. Even if you tell someone that that's true, they still have their own perspective on the world. AI doesn't. Right? AI doesn't care. AI doesn't have a side. AI doesn't have I care more about fairness over loyalty. You just tell them, here's the profile of someone who you're trying to convince. Now craft an argument. And we did this in one study where we asked ChatGPT to come up with short political speeches advocating for climate action. So we just told it, and again, it's because it's thread the entire internet, it understands everything, right? The only prompt that you need for that is to say, write me a short political speech advocating for climate action for someone who scores high on the moral foundation of loyalty, and it does a tremendous job coming up with that, as opposed to like high on the dimension of fairness. And you can also see once you adjust it to who's on the other side, people think of the argument as more convincing. And they also, at least in our hypothetical experiments, say that they would be willing to donate more money to the campaign of a politician. So I think there's, in a way, a huge potential to use some of that.
But I also think that organizations can use this to change behavior within, because a lot of what Patty and I spent our careers doing was, the organization's doing Y. We want them to do X. How do we get them to do X instead of Y? And so I also think that that could be interesting in terms of how you message your organization and how you motivate them to behave in the way that you need them to behave to get to the next milestone.
Yeah. And what we tried to do really, really crudely was, we're going to try and hire people who are going to have that foundation to be open to that. But that's sort of ham-handed way of doing it. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, it's a fascinating topic because like the one thing that we know is that essentially liberals, when it comes to being open to other political perspectives, are actually more close-minded. So when you look at like what are the friend circle of liberals, it's much more homogeneous. It's like much more stacked with other people who are like-minded. So there's like almost, and I've been fascinated with that because it's almost like this paradox. It's like we're liberal up to the point, or like we're tolerant up to the point that we think that other people are not tolerant, and that's when we stop being. It's like a really interesting question. Yes. But I think in organizations, when you translate that, right? So I think like the political sphere is like so polarized, and it's like you can easily distinguish between like Democrats and Republicans. But I do think that even in like, right, if you think about organizations, there's constantly these identities that we craft. Like you always hear this thing about, well, it's the business people against the engineers. And maybe there would actually be like
Jessica just said, are there any salespeople that are introverts?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean,
and I think you could
sweeping generalization. Yeah.
But you could totally use this kind of, let's say you have like a team of engineers, they think in a certain way, right? And oftentimes it's even just like the way that we speak, the way that we approach a problem. Like we have these joint sessions in the negotiations class that I teach between the business school and the law school. And you can see they're working on the same problem, but they're approaching it from totally different ways, right? Our MBA students, they do the spreadsheets and they do the numbers. And then the law students, they talk about process. And it really takes a while for them to get on the same page and say like, okay, we're working the same problem just from different perspectives. And I could totally see how there's a benefit of having AI almost mediate this, right? It's like you have the business people and the lawyers, or you have the business people and the engineers. And now there's like this translator in the middle that kind of says, okay, look, maybe this was the point that you were missing because that's not how you think about it, but here's why it's important. And it's because, as I said, like the fact that AI is a little bit less human, in this case also makes it less egocentric.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. You brought up negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to talk about that. Like we're constantly negotiating in life, like I'm negotiating with my 5-year-old all day. Like, okay, you can have more of this if you do, put your clothes on right now. Like, get dressed. It's, he never wants to get dressed. Then there's sort of the personal life, whether it's with your child or your spouse or whomever. And then there's, work life. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us a little bit about negotiation and what you've learned and some tricks to the trade, if you will.
Very happy to. And it's a funny story. So I got my PhD in psychology and then transitioned to the business school after. And I joined Columbia in 2017. So I get the job and I'm just freaking happy that I landed this dream job. So I immediately accept the offer. I'm like, this is amazing. Just like I would take anything. And I think I show up week number 2. They're like, okay, here's your schedule. Here's what you're supposed to teach in the next 5 years, and you're going to teach negotiations. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. I'm the worst person to teach negotiations. I absolutely hated. I hated negotiations so badly. I thought it was like a terrible idea for me to teach it because I clearly hadn't negotiated even my offer. And it's flipped entirely. So I think that the first year I was like just barely ahead of the students, admittedly, but my entire perspective on negotiations has changed so much. So I think before I really studied it, and I got into the art and science, if you want, I thought of it as just like a fight, and it's like either I win, the other side wins. There's like so much uncertainty. They're out to get me, and really kind of someone has to lose. And it's not, there's no nice outcome. And for me, the way that I think about it now, and I can get into why I think this in just a second, I think of it right now much more as creative problem solving. And it's so much more enjoyable, right? If you think about negotiation as like, hey, here's a puzzle that's sitting in front of you, and now you're trying to solve it, and you make the puzzle pieces work such that it comes to a great outcome for both of you. Sometimes there's even more people. Such a different experience.
Yeah, I love that framing. But how do you, because some of these things that we're negotiating, like salary or, whatever, they're pretty emotional things. So how do you get from the emotion to that framing?
Yeah, I think it's such a good insight, because I think the reason for why most people hate negotiations is that they're either worried that they're going to destroy a relationship, right? So they're worried that maybe they can get a good deal, but they're going to blow up a relationship, or they're worried that they're actually going to be screwed over, or they're not getting a good deal. So the way that I think about negotiations now is essentially, and it's funny because it's coming back to this perspective taking topic that we talked about before, right? We don't think about the world in the same way. So most negotiations don't evolve around a single topic, right? So even if take the salary negotiation that you mentioned, almost never is money the only thing that we negotiate over in a salary negotiation when we're negotiating a contract, right? And salary, like whenever money is involved, that's probably a topic that is actually hard, right? Because we can't have the same $1,000 in both of our pockets. But there's so many other things that you can negotiate. There could be anything from vacation days. Where are you going to be based? What's your job title? How quickly can you get promoted again? And the one thing that we know in negotiations is that very rarely do we actually value the same things equally, right? So it could be, for example, that for me, having a lot of vacation is extremely important because I love going on trips around the world. I love spending time home with my family because that's the only time that I actually get to go back. So I know that I clearly want more vacation days, and my employer probably wants me to have less, but I care about this vacation like a lot. So for me, getting one day extra actually creates a ton of value. Whereas like kind of getting a day less is like, yeah, better for my employer, but no, it doesn't really matter that much. Could be something else that is like, how many hours do I work? It could be, what's the location? What's my job title? I couldn't care less about the job title. Maybe it matters a lot for my employer to kind of give me a lower ranking so that I can climb up later on, right? So the fact that we think about items in a negotiation differently, we don't want the same thing, but just the value that we place on each of the items might differ. So what we can do in negotiations, and that's what I think is like the creative part about it, is really trying to figure out what matters to the other side, right? What's driving the other side crazy because they really, really want it. So the best negotiators are the ones that are obsessed trying to figure out what matters to the other side. And not necessarily.
Stop there.
Yeah.
That's really, really important.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I ever thought of it that way.
No, me
and I've done
neither.
a lot of negotiations.
Yeah.
But wow, that's a really important
And what
concept.
I love about it, I think so, there's this obsession with what matters to the other side. Oftentimes when I tell my students about this, they were like, well, you're not just like a charitable person, right? So like, why should I be giving something to the other side? That's just because you want to be a nice person, or what's behind that? And it's actually not, right? So the moment, like imagine I can give you something that means the world to you. Like I can give Patty something that she's always dreamt of, super important. Now I could do this because I'm a nice person, and now I've just given up in the negotiation. I could also do this because I know that maybe giving this to Patty now allows me to ask something back and ask for something that really, really means the world to me. I think about it almost like on the flip side helps me. Like the world's most stupid concession is if you give up something that means the world to you and doesn't give you a lot of credit with the other side, right? If you kind of give up something that really hurts you and the other side is like, yeah, that's a nice to have. That's a stupid one. What you really want is you want to give something that creates a lot of value for the other side and doesn't cost you that much. So find something that you might be happy to give up, even though it would have been nicer to have it, and then ask for something.
How do you find out what's important to the other side? How do you know? I
think that's a great question. I mean, the one thing, right, if we most of us, when we come into negotiations, we're so focused on trying to get our point across. We're so focused on trying to persuade the other side. The most important thing is listening, right? So the most important thing is asking questions like, why are you here? What matters to you? You can just kind of come in and say, look, you don't have to put all cards on the table, but can you tell me the one or two things that are really important to you? And I promise that I'm here to kind of try and make this work for all of us. So if you establish this baseline level of trust and you ask the right questions, and you also kind of, you have to give something, right? So it's not that you can just extract all of the information from the other side and they tell you what they care about. Sometimes you just have to lead by example. So if the other side is like a little bit more cagey and they're worried that you're going to just exploit them, you could just be like, let's say, okay, let me just go first. Here's two things in this negotiation that really matter to me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what's important to you? And that's kind of how you, based on this law of reciprocity, you actually kind of, at some point, it feels so awkward, right? So the more you reveal, it feels really hard for the other side to not answer any of your questions. And that's oftentimes how you get the other side to open up. And then once you can show them, look, by opening up, I can actually give you something that was important to you. You kind of increase the level of trust, and then usually kind of that opens the door for more honest conversations where both sides reveal their preferences, and then you can again put those puzzle pieces together.
Amazing. I wanted to talk a little bit about what you're teaching these days, and like who are these business school students, and what are they learning, and what are they gonna do with the world?
What are they going to
We need some smart people.
Give us a peek into the future.
Give us a peek into the future. Actually, my teaching is pretty scattered. So I teach, as I said, negotiations. That was just dumped on me, and I love the class. Just because it's so interactive. You can really see how it changes students' mindset, right? So I think most of them come in like I'm just trying to fight everybody else and I'm trying to win this negotiation. And it's so nice to see them come out and say like, no, there's actually a much better way. That's a lot more collaborative and good for everybody. So that's one of the classes that I teach. I teach the Intro to Leadership. So that has I think of it as a sampler of what business school has to offer in terms of leadership. So we do, like 3 hours on decision making, 3 hours on teams, 3 hours on culture. So it's very short. But I think it just gives them a great overview of like, here's what matters when it comes to leadership. And then the other part that's much more related to what we were talking about in the beginning is the ethics of personal data. So to what extent, there's like this quote that I really like by the tech historian Melvin Kranzberg. He said, technology is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. And for me, the last part is the most important one, right? Because if it depends on us, then it very much depends on leadership. So the reason for why I love this class in the context of business is those are the people who are going to make decisions of like, how do you implement AI? How do you use personal data? And they have the opportunity to use it in a way that's ethical and in the best interest of people. So those are the things that I'm teaching. And students vary widely. That's what I love about this space is we have MBA students, maybe like, I guess when I started business school, they were essentially my age. I think I started at 27 and they were like all my age, and now not anymore. But so they're relatively young, but then all the way to executive MBAs. They're much older, teaching the executive education program. So then you really get people from all over the world and with all kinds of backgrounds. And that's what makes it interesting, right? So you come into a negotiations class and you have like these frameworks that help them think through some of the problems, but you also get their experience. So then, you have people from the US, but then someone kind of comes from, let's say, China, and the way that they negotiate or the problems that they face are totally different. And you suddenly have this discussion of like, well, how do we integrate all of this in a world that's global when it comes to business? So that's what I love about it. Like the discussions in the classroom just keep me on my toes.
Oh, I'm sure. And you sometimes teach about the Netflix culture deck.
I do teach about that. It's in an hour, and we have an entire video on Netflix and the culture. And I think one of the way that we talk about it is essentially that culture frames like norms in organizations, right? So we talk about how to motivate people, how to enable people and make it easy for them to do the right thing. And culture, in a way, just sets like these almost invisible boundaries that they don't really kind of tell people what to do. It doesn't really tell people what to do, but it kind of showcases what is expected, how do we do things. And the way that we talk about the culture deck is essentially like in the way that Netflix evolved, right? In the beginning, it was like very much focused on DVDs and like content. Now it's like almost like an entertainment kind of content creation platform. And it would have been really difficult to make that transition, right? So if you look at the early pictures, it's a whole bunch of like computer science nerds. So it's like a completely nerdy kind of group of people, and I love it. And then now you look at it, and it's like this glamorous Hollywood stuff. And
They're
this
both
transition,
still there.
yeah, and it would have been so difficult to combine and integrate these two kind of different cultures if there wasn't like a consistent. Here's actually what the values that we have and what we stand for. So that's the way that we talk about it. Is like making some of these transitions becomes a lot easier when you know like the core set of values that people buy into.
You know, the last time I did a talk at a Stanford MBA program about the Netflix culture, most of the people in the class, when asked, you know, what do you think? Would you like to join a company with this kind of culture? Said no.
Can you tell me what?
It's in the class that I was in, you know, they're like, no, it's not predictable enough. I want a career path. I want more predictability. No, it's too scary. I was so shocked, you know, here I'm like, you know, featured speaker and they're all going to like fawn over it.
We hate it.
They're like,
But then also like the Stanford, I'm sure they're like happy to just be controversial and say like, no, we don't want. But I do think, I mean, I think there's something about like at least MBAs these days, but generally speaking, it's incredibly expensive, right? So doing an MBA in the US is just insanely expensive. And so like if you're mid-20s, you're planning to have a family, the fact that and Scott Galloway talks about this, and I think it's actually like a good argument that for like this period in your life, you probably want to have more stability, right? Because you're not just responsible for yourself, you're also responsible for most of the people in your family. So your 20s, probably look for stability. And then after, it becomes much easier to take these risks, right? Once you're kind of somewhat established, then taking this risk and working in a culture that's a little bit more hit and miss, I think it's just much easier than for the really young MBAs.
Well, listen, anytime you want Patty and I come talk to your class, just let us know.
Yeah, I love it. I love having guest speakers. Because it's just like, I mean, it's so funny because what I can tell them, look, here's what science says and here's how it's being implemented. And they're like, well, what do you know? And then, you bring in a speaker and they say exactly the same thing. And it's like the former VP of Apple. And they're like, okay, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
maybe.
yeah.
Well, listen, will you join us in a career confession? The title of the question is, how do I decide who to promote without devaluing anyone? 2 members of my team are both top performers and both in line for a promotion into a potential new role. I'm concerned about how to handle the transparency. I don't want to turn it into a competition as they've had issues in the past working together, but I also don't want one to feel undervalued when the other one gets it. I also feel responsible for their career progressions, especially when performance-wise, they're always neck and neck. Do you have any tips or factors external to performance that I should consider?
Well, man, I'm glad that I work in academia, not in industry. I would be absolutely terrible at these things. Any other factors the one thing that I think is always super interesting is when it comes to setting criteria is involve them. right? So like what we know is like if you give people voice and choice over the criteria, the favorite example that I have, which we actually also use in the leadership class, is somewhat similar situation when it comes to allocating scarce resources was after the Second World War. And some of the soldiers got to come back. They were done fighting in Europe, were allowed to come back, and some had to go and continue fighting in Asia. And they were super worried about how to select the criteria, right? Is it like how long you've already been overseas, whether you have dependents at home, because they knew that any kind of criteria that they pick would be considered unfair by some of them. So what they did is actually they asked the soldiers. So they asked the soldiers to come up with their own criteria and a scoring system to say, well, here's how many points you get for having family at home. Here's how many points you get if you were wounded in combat, for example. And so what happened is because they selected the criteria, even the people who didn't get to go home, most of them thought that the procedure was really fair. So I think in this case, instead of you selecting the criteria, there could be a way in which you actually involve both people and say, like, look, we're going to try and come up with what are the things that are actually important for promotions. So even for the person, there's like this distinction that we make between procedural justice and then outcome justice. So it's essentially, do you get what you want and do you think the process was fair? And what you can like the person who's not going to get the promotion is probably not going to be super thrilled, right? Because they didn't get what they wanted. But if they think the procedure of getting there was fair, they're actually just disappointed and they're not outraged. And I think the best way of getting there is by just involving them in the process of saying, like, what are the criteria that we're using? What are we looking for? That's the best I can come up with.
No, and I think that's pretty good. I think that's really good. Yeah. And I think back to, when I was getting promoted to CHRO at Netflix, Patty had already gone, and then it was between me and another woman. And Reed, who was our CEO, he was very transparent but we didn't get to help in the criteria picking, but he was very transparent with us about the fact that we were both up for the role, and it was a bit like a competition. So it did feel like I was on American Idol every day being judged. But we knew we had to do the same things. We got invited to the same meetings. I mean, it was very fair. And then, at the end of the day, I ended up getting the promotion, which was good for me. And it was less good for the other person. But I think we walked away as actually better friends because we had gone through this weird experience with one another. And we both, I think, respected the process and knew that it was fair. Right.
Right. And I would say that you probably also knew, because it was kind of, you knew enough about what at least he was thinking about what the future is going to look like. So I would say my input is, it's not just about the criteria. It's about what the criteria is for the business going forward. And that's who you make the selection about, right? Yeah. It's oftentimes not just who's the most qualified, but it's who's most qualified to do the work that's going to happen, not that has happened.
Yeah.
And that's always my big beef with these sort of things, is that people think, well, I have tenure, this academia, right? I've been here the longest. I've taught the most classes. I've whatever, I checked off more boxes than Jessica, so I should get the job. And the truth is, if Jessica's skills are more relevant to the problems coming up, then it doesn't really matter how many years it's about what you're going to be able to do next year. So that's my 2 cents on this one.
I love it. Well, Sandra, it was so fun having you. I'm so grateful for the internet and finding you, because this was just a fascinating conversation, and I do hope you'll come back.
I hope so too. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.